All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is Left Bank Books welcomes nationally recognized trainer and consultant on the intersection of race, adolescence, and policing, Kristin Henning, who will discuss her new book, The Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth. Tonight, Henning will be in conversation with law professor at Howard Law and executive director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center, Justin Hansford. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Kristen and Justin, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. We offer in-store shopping, curbside pickup, and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world even. We are happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoyed this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you or for your friends at left-bank.com. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating, and it also allows us to keep this event series going and bringing you incredible authors. So thank you so much for your support. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from you, the audience, at the end of the event, so you can type your questions as a comment, and you can do that at any point in time as the question comes to your mind. And be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook and YouTube to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. And now about tonight's book, The Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth. A brilliant analysis of the foundations of racist policing in America, the day-to-day brutalities largely hidden from public view endured by Black youth growing up under constant police surveillance, and the persistent threat of physical and psychological abuse. Drawing upon 25 years of experience representing Black youth in Washington, D.C.'s juvenile courts, Kristen Henning confronts America's irrational, manufactured fears of those people and makes a powerfully compelling case that the crisis in racist American policing begins with its relationship to Black children. Henning explains how discriminatory and aggressive policing has socialized a generation of Black teenagers to fear, resent, and resist the police, and she details the long-term consequences of racism that they experience at the hands of the police and their vigilante surrogates. She makes clear that unlike white youth, who are afforded the freedom to test boundaries, experiment with sex and drugs, and figure out who they are and who they want to be, Black youth are seen as a threat to white America and are denied healthy adolescent development. She examines the criminalization of Black adolescent play and sexuality and of Black fashion, hair, and music. She limns the effects of police presence in schools and the depth of police-induced trauma in Black adolescents, especially in the wake of recent unprecedented worldwide outrage at racial injustice and inequality. The Rage of Innocence is an essential book for our moment. James Foreman Jr., the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Locking Up Our Own, says, "We've long needed a great book on race and the juvenile legal system. Thanks to Chris Henning, we have it. Deeply researched and passionately argued, The Rage of Innocence details how we criminalize Black children and explains how we can stop." And now about tonight's speakers. Kristen Henning is a nationally recognized trainer and consultant on the intersection of race, adolescence, and policing. She is the Bloom Professor of Law and Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at the Georgetown University Law Center. From 1998 to 2001, she was the lead attorney of the juvenile unit at the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia. Awards she has received include the 2021 Leadership Prize from the Juvenile Law Center and the 2013 Robert E. Shepard Jr. Award for Excellence in Juvenile Defense from the National Juvenile Defender Center. And tonight, Chris will be in conversation with Justin Hansford. Justin is a professor of law at Howard University, also founder and executive director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center, Professor Hansford was previously a Democracy Project Fellow at Harvard University, a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center, and an associate professor of law at St. Louis University. He has a BA from Howard University and a JD from Georgetown University Law Center. He was a founder of the Georgetown Journal of Law and Modern Critical Race Perspectives. Professor Hansford has received a Fulbright Scholar Award to study the legal career of Nelson Mandela and served as a clerk for Judge Damon J. Keith on the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. He is a leading scholar and activist in critical race theory, human rights and law, and social movements. He is the co-author of the forthcoming 7th edition of Race, Racism, and American Law. In the wake of the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, Professor Hansford worked to empower the Ferguson community through community-based legal advocacy. He co-authored the Ferguson to Geneva Human Rights Shadow Report and accompanied the Ferguson protesters and Mike Brown's family to Geneva, Switzerland to testify at the United Nations. Professor Hansford has served as a policy advisor for proposed post-Ferguson reforms. At the local, state, and federal level, he testified before the Ferguson Commission, the Missouri Advisory Committee to the United States Civil Rights Commission, and President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And now, without further ado, I'm so happy and proud to welcome for Left Bank Books our incredible guests for the evening, Kristin Henning and Justin Hansford. Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I'm so happy to be back in St. Louis, even if it's only virtually. My experiences there from 2011 and 2016 shaped how I think about race and justice in the law. And the other environment, of course, is Georgetown Law School. The other environment that shaped me, where Chris has been a leader and a teacher for so many years, and has had a lot of impact on my background. So welcome. This is going to be a wonderful conversation. I'm very happy to be in conversation with Chris here at Left Bank Books.
Right back at you, Justin. Happy to be here.
It's going to be great. All right. So, Chris, you've been defending children in D.C. for 25 years. And you write that over that period of time, you've only defended 4 white clients.
Yeah.
In D.C., just like in St. Louis, the children arrested and brought into the juvenile court are overwhelmingly Black children. So many people probably could assume that this is because Black children are disproportionately committing crimes or committing those crimes at higher rates. But in your book, you write that your research demonstrates that children of all races engage in risky behaviors at similar rates. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? And why is it that Black youth are arrested more often if they aren't actually committing crimes more often?
Absolutely. What a great way to start this conversation, really just setting that stage. And what most people don't realize is that researchers have been collecting data about teenagers' behavior for years. And when I say collecting data about teenagers' behavior, I mean self-reported behavior. So there has been 40 years of what they call self-report studies from the University of Michigan and the Center for Disease Control that confirm that youth of all races and ethnicities admit to being involved in risky, irresponsible, and even delinquent and dangerous behaviors. It is part and parcel what it means to be a teenager, impulsive, sensation-seeking, not thinking ahead to the consequences. And so data, some of the most recent data, for example, from 2018 shows that more than 58% of high school teenagers surveyed in that year reported having tried alcohol by the 12th grade. 43% talked about or admitted to having been drunk in some significant way. 49% of all teenagers reported that they had tried marijuana by the 12th grade. And so there's nothing in this data that suggests that Black children are inherently any more reckless, impulsive, or dangerous than any other kids. In fact, notwithstanding maybe some differences, Dustin, between maybe the type of drug that's being used or the type of weapons or some other subtle differences like that, the research shows that white youth are just as likely and sometimes more likely to report these types of behaviors. For example, especially around drugs, Black teenagers tend to be more likely to use marijuana, but many, if not most other drugs are much more common among white youth. Hallucinogens, Oxycontin, Vicodin, amphetamine, and the like. So it's really, it's a myth that Black children are engaged in criminal behavior. And even offenses like a fight at school or assaultive type behavior, research shows that white youth are just as likely to report having carried some sort of weapon to school, whether it be a knife or a club or something else, just as likely, if not more likely, than Black youth. So, I mean, you asked the second question, right, which was a really important one. So if this is true, if this data is right, collected by CDC and others, then why is it that we see so many Black children in places like St. Louis, Washington, D.C., and all across the country? And the answer is simply this, that the fears and the presumptions about Black children being criminal, being dangerous, to be feared is so deeply embedded in the American psyche. And some of that has been, as Shane talked about in the introduction, has been manufactured or intentionally orchestrated to control the lives of Black children during adolescence, while much of it, especially today, is just embedded in the implicit biases that we have. And so I'll just say this, we all have to acknowledge that there is a long history in America of treating Black children like criminals. If we think back to the civil rights era and to the lynching of Emmett Till, the only way we as a society can justify that type of brutality is to claim that the Emmett Tills of the world are a threat, and specifically a threat to Black women, a threat to white women. And so we've seen that throughout history, the ways in which this narrative has been used to limit, to exclude, to resist integration, to resist civil rights. And so now those fears, those that were once intentionally created, have now been incorporated into our cognitive reality or our cognitive thinking about Black children. And we treat them as truth. And so when many people, even the most egalitarian people, walk through a park, they're afraid of Black children. They're afraid of the Mike Browns and the Tamir Rices of the world. So
even Black people oftentimes
Yes.
are subject to that type of racialization. And I just have to say, think your thoughts were so profound in light of the fact that so much of our programming in this area is going to be based from the premise that there's a deficit in the behavior of Black youth. And so it's the youth that we have to change, the Black youth in particular, because there's some sort of special level of misbehavior that they are engaged in, which must be the premise for the differentials in arrests and enforcement.
That's right.
So profound. So I want to keep that conversation going and focus a bit on the city of St. Louis, a city that I love. I know that I'm not there in person, but we're there virtually. And, the St. Louis, of course, after what happened on August 9th, 2014, had to experience a number of seismic changes. And also St. Louis and Ferguson became a place where people came to study. That included the Department of Justice in 2015. They found that St. Louis was discriminating against African-American children when they did a Department of Justice Civil Rights Division investigation. They found that after a 20-month investigation, Black children are 47% more likely than comparable white children to have their cases, their misbehavior turned into a formal case as opposed to being diverted to other types of discipline that would be less harmful in the long run. 2.5 more times likely to be held in custody pre-trial, 2.7 times as likely to be sentenced to detention at the end of their cases, 3 times as likely to be put in detention for violating probation. And this analysis, and there's another study in 2017 saying that Black youth account for 2/3 of referrals to the juvenile courts in St. Louis County Family Court, which is remarkable because Black teens comprise only 1/3 of the population between ages 10 and 17. So we see that even though, as you said, Black youth engage in the same types of behaviors, they're arrested more often than white youth and treated differently throughout the system. And so oftentimes this includes discipline for low-level offenses,
Right.
where comparable white children, may not be sent to court or arrested, but may get a slap on the wrist from their teacher or parent. So how do we explain this discrepancy? How is it that in St. Louis, as in cities around the country, we continue to see these instances of minor offenses, not the serious violent crimes that most people think about, but minor offenses being the grounds for the school to prison pipeline?
I'm so glad you raised that, because I can't tell you the number of times people say to me, well, so much of your book, not all of it, but so much of your book is about low-level normal adolescent behaviors. And so what about those violent, murders and homicides and whatnot? And what people don't realize is that the serious violent offenses are so small, rare. They make the headlines, but that across the country, the vast majority, 80%, in many places and nationally, 80% of offenses for which all youth of all races are low-level, minor, non-violent offenses, right? Not person to person related types of offenses. And that data is no different from Black youth. And some recent data showed us that only 9% of arrests by Black youth across the country involve some serious violent offense, like a murder, a rape, a robbery, things that we tend to think about and that get sensationalized in the media. And not to say those things aren't important, but when we think about and we talk about how to respond and why our country, you ask, is so afraid of children, is because we have made these assumptions, these links that Black children are not just criminal, but violent and dangerous. And so we then become intolerant of even the normal adolescent behaviors. We just aren't willing to give them the benefit of being impulsive, reactive, emotional, experimenting like we give our own children. And so I think that's really important for us to understand. And as we were talking about American legacy of fear and how it was intentionally orchestrated and then gets embedded in society, we can't not also acknowledge what happened in the 80s and the 90s. So when there was a temporary uptick in crime, and this is really important as we're coming out of the pandemic, and there have been some uptick in crime across the country, people begin to say, oh Lord, we've got to be afraid again. But remember, even when we have temporary uptick in crime, the questions become, what do we do about it? How do we respond, right? Through rehabilitative responsive, restorative responses, things of that nature. But that also we have to be careful not to demonize Black youth in those moments. And so when we think about the 80s and 90s, many of you who are listening will remember, and I know you will, Justin, the super predator myth. Right. That was really at the heart on the war against poverty, the war, against crime. and really the ways in which Black youth were explicitly ostracized, right, through this pseudo scientific theories put forth by John DiIulio from Princeton, claiming that the nation was going to be overrun by this raging band of super predators. And he explicitly said, most of whom will be Black. Right. And so that legacy is hugely significant in so much of the juvenile legal system. For example, it was during the 80s and the 90s, in response to that super predator myth, that states across the country changed their purpose clauses to make them more punitive. The response to children became more punitive. More children were transferred to adult court pursuant to these new statutes, and were transferred for more types of offenses. And so the legacy is deep. It's both psychological and, again, became actualized through our laws and structures.
That's right. I'm an 80s baby, and I remember in the late 80s, early 90s, those conversations happening and really driving people's behavior. And, you know, as we talk about the experience from the perspective of the Black youth themselves who experienced those types of discourses and the criminalization of their lives and their culture, you know, I think about a client that you wrote about in chapter 9, Kevin,
right,
who became afraid to leave his house because he was convinced that police were outside waiting for him. You know, when I was in St. Louis in 2014, I met a number of young protesters who, you know, so many of the protesters in Ferguson were youth themselves. If you think about some of these groups and how they themselves became traumatized. Now, I became traumatized by the experience as an adult. You know, I think about some of these younger protesters and how they, you know, the Lost Voices is one name that comes to mind. You know, all these different groups. How is it that they experience those interactions? There was a study released earlier this year by a professor at SLU, St. Louis University, Dr. Michael Vaughn, showing that youth of color who witness non-fatal police stops marked by heightened harsh uses of harsh language, threats, use of force, even if not fatal, are equally traumatized as those who witness fatal police encounters, because there's research that has shown, and we had done some of this research at the Thurgood Marshall Center also. You know, when you're in that interaction with police, you can't really avoid them because you never know when they show up. You're not supposed to fight back, so you can't protect yourself from it.
Right.
There's so many reasons that type of violence causes so much mental anguish and fear. And, you know, I don't think people realize how traumatizing police encounters can be for everyone, but let alone for young people, especially Black youth who don't, as you were saying, who haven't fully developed their capacities to manage their emotions and things like that. So what did you learn about the ways Black youth, like your client, Kevin, experienced hypersurveillance by police?
Absolutely. I mean, you're spot on. Chapter 9 is called Policing as Trauma. And it is really an important chapter, in my mind, one of the most important chapters. But just as you said, Justin, that as I talk about policing as trauma, I really try to bring to life the narratives of the young people that I work with in Washington, D.C., as well as stories that I have collected and heard across the country from young people. And I think the best way to really understand the traumatic experiences of young people in heavily policed neighborhoods is to talk to the young people themselves. So there's that. But what that led me to do, Justin, is exactly what you said. Let me look at the empirical research. So if I'm talking to, and I would, my client, Kevin, literally would call us and say he was afraid to come outside because he could see a police car parked out in front of his house. All right. And such an incredibly important moment. So what does the research say? It's exactly what you your colleague at SLU found. But there has been a growing body of psychological research demonstrating the intense trauma that young people experience in contact with the police, and particularly Black and Latinx youth. What the research shows is that young people who have been in frequent contact with the police experience high rates of fear, anxiety, hopelessness, hypervigilance, meaning that they're always on guard, distrusting the police. And it's important to recognize that that distrust of police officers gets translated to other state actors, like teachers, probation officers, all, many figures of authority. And just as you were talking about in the research that you read, research shows what's so powerful is the research shows that young people, even those who are not the direct targets of that those police stops, still experience the same types of symptoms. So vicarious trauma, right? Vicarious contact with the police, such as by hearing about it from friends, family, or witnessing, just having to worry about becoming the victim of some sort of police target or police brutality. And then the research goes further to say, even watching these incidents of police violence online or on television, even involving people we do not know, is just as traumatic as being there. And so some of the studies I think were really fascinating that I found were follow-up studies to what was happening with what happened to people after they watched the Twin Towers collapse, or the Boston Marathon bombing, or even watching people stranded on the bridges after Hurricane Katrina. When they did the empirical research, they found that people were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder just from watching those incidents. Right? Powerful. And so now these newer studies are looking at that and figuring out what the impact upon young people is from watching those police brutality encounters. And so what we see is, like my client, is there are a number of studies, wellness studies that have been conducted in major cities like Chicago, Denver, St. Paul, Philadelphia, in which young people are reporting, right, that the leading barriers to adolescent health is poor police-youth relationships. Wow. And that their fear and mistrust of police officers led them to avoid public spaces, right? That's traumatizing when we think about how incredibly important outdoor public recreation time is for healthy adolescent development. So critical,
yeah. Boy, such a powerful chapter, and so important for us to think about. But in addition to the mental health issue, you also make the connection between over policing and the way Black youth perceive and respond to police. So in a context where tensions between Black youth and police are at an all-time high, you actually listened to those voices and shared some of the voices of the Black youth, including some of them who live in St. Louis, and let them tell you in their own words, how it is that they experience their interactions with police officers. And there's one really interesting portion on page 157 where you talk about how Black youth resent pedestrian stops, vehicle stops, and also the patrolling of their neighborhoods. And Black boys and girls say that officers treat them as if they were always criminal, no matter what, and complain that police are mean and disrespectful, don't know how to talk to Black people. And it's the youth in St. Louis who reported that the majority of the time their police interactions happen when they weren't doing anything wrong. Just more fully elaborating on that point, that this is not seen as something that's based on desert or merit, but harassment that comes based on their identity. Frustrated by the inability of officers to distinguish between those who are engaged in crime and those who aren't. The youth just have a lot of resentment for these arbitrary stops, as they should in many ways, and they learn that obeying the laws doesn't make a difference. So why bother? And why look at the police as a group that can help you? So in that situation, you use the phrase contempt of cop.
Yeah.
And that is something that has been also written about in the literature. Police officers who see simply having an attitude as a good enough reason to arrest someone, even a black youth, and charge them with some sort of resisting type of charge just because they don't show admiration and adoration for the cop.
Respect for authority, right?
Yeah, exactly. So now, so how does this play out with youth in particular?
Yeah.
In your view.
And so just to be clear, so the stories that are collected from St. Louis were collected by some wonderful researchers. So Rod K. Brunson, for those of you who don't know his work and are interested in looking at the qualitative work he did interviewing young people there, was really powerful. And what I discovered about the narratives that were collected from young people in St. Louis matched my own experiences with young people in Washington, D.C., and other stories that have been collected, Connecticut, other places. Really powerful stuff and worth reading. And a lot of that is in, as Justin, as you talk about, in a chapter called Contempt of Cop in my book, chapter 7 in particular. And you're absolutely right. So this notion of contempt of cop, this idea that if you don't demonstrate respect, if you don't follow to the T authority, if you videotape an officer while they're trying to make an arrest, you are in contempt of cop. It's it's not a real charge, right? And so they have to come up with a real charge. And as you said, Justin, it's often things like disorderly conduct, resisting arrest. They might call it threats if you're talking back to an officer. They might even call it assault on a police officer if you pull away from the officer or do anything that is remotely aggressive. And your question is spot on. Like, how does this play out, particularly with young people, with adolescents, right? So it plays out with adults, but it's amplified with young people. So think about what we've been talking about and everything we know about adolescence. Think about what you were like when you were a teenager. Think about what it's like to raise teenagers. Think about what it's like to teach teenagers, and all of the things we keep saying: impulsive, not thinking ahead to the long-term consequences, emotional. Here's another one. Young people are fairness fanatics. How many of you had your teenagers say, you know what, that's just unfair? But as you indicated, young people often don't have the words, right, to calmly and maturely articulate that injustice. And especially when it's emotionally charged, fast-paced, and overlaid with fear of the police. So these police encounters often go from 0 to 100 with a teenager. Because a teenager is being a teenager and the adults aren't being adults, right? They're not being calm and allowing the child to calm down. And so instead, a teenager will yell, will curse, maybe they'll stomp away, they'll talk back, they'll be disrespectful, dissing the cops, right? And the officer responds in kind. Right? Instead of taking the high road. And so you'll see young people, especially getting these low-level offenses or these offenses that make them look particularly aggressive as a result of some verbal banter that the officer did not like. And, you talked about the DOJ investigations in Ferguson, and part of that report acknowledged or found that the local school district in Ferguson often, the officers, in the local school district in Ferguson often use force against students of color for disciplinary violations like failure to comply with instructions, right? Peace disturbance. They report in one of the DOJ, in the Ferguson DOJ study, that a 15-year-old girl was slammed against a locker and arrested for not following the officer's order to go to the principal's office. And so what we're seeing is arrest for kids being kids, right? And physical force for kids being kids. Yes, we have to manage, adolescent behaviors in school. Yes, we cannot let the children run amok. But the question is, do we need to criminalize them, right? Do we need to arrest them? How would you manage and navigate those behaviors if they were your own kids? You're not putting them in a handcuff. You're not beating them down. You're thinking about behavior management strategies, de-escalation strategies, social emotional engagement with young people. So
important to make that point. And as you describe the idea of contempt of cop, and this idea that people in law enforcement have, that everyone is supposed to be so deferential to them, even when they're young and they don't have impulse control and they're afraid. You have to come back to the situation that happened on August 9th, 2014. And, we know that, Mike Brown was walking in the street. Darren Wilson cut him off and told him basically get the F out of the street. Mike Brown was alleged not to have simply deferred and been deferential in that situation. And there was a conflict. And so, you actually talk about the Mike Brown case, and you talk about the narrative Darren Wilson used, and that the media provided a platform for, and in some cases, media itself promulgated the narrative that Mike Brown was some sort of monster. The famous phrase, he was no angel. And, a lot of this hinging on his size or his age and his appearance, the way he wore his hat and style. But what does Darren Wilson's and the media's treatment of Mike Brown tell us about the larger problems and the ways that Black youth are treated and perceived in the United States today?
I had to include the story of Mike Brown in this book because it is so, in so many ways, a demonstration. It could have fit, honestly, in multiple chapters in the book, but it's such a demonstration of the whole phenomena of the criminalization of Black youth. Right. And so, it starts with, it's interesting. We're talking about contempt of cop, and folks will remember vividly that the folks were outraged that, as you said, Darren Wilson cut Mike Brown off in the road and tried to talk to him. And Michael Brown did what? He used profanity. He said, F what you have to say. All right. So he dropped the F-bomb at the officer, at Darren Wilson. And people use that to demonstrate just how violent and angry, he was. Again, what did we just talk about? These are young people protesting in their own way, speaking out in the ways that they best know how in this emotionally charged, fast-paced moment. And so he had no respect for this officer, as so many Black children, unfortunately, today have little trust and faith in the police, given all that they've seen, right? And what we have to remember is that even if, this is putting Darren Wilson aside, but even when an officer, I say this all the time, when an officer approaches a young person with the best of intentions, even in a wellness check, they have to remember that the blue uniform carries with it the history of oppression in American country, because it was police officers, that have been used generation after generation to enforce the racial segregation and the like. And so when a teenager says F you, to the police, that is not cause for violence, right? It's got to be understood in this context. So that's number one. I mean, there's so many lessons in this story. But then, in addition, the ways in which Darren Wilson demonized his language was absolutely dehumanizing. He talks about Mike as if he is literally as if he's an animal, describing him as grunting and the like. Also describing him as the Hulk, like as if he's the Incredible Hulk, creating this imagery. This is the language that we use about Black children. And let me be clear, this is honestly one of the most ironic things. Somebody who was very supportive of the book, right? Meaning who really engages with young people, has progressive understanding of criminalization, was reading an early chapter of the book for me and said to me, "Oh, you do realize that you included Mike Brown in your book. You know he was an adult." And I was like, wow. And actually it was a Black woman. And I was like, wow, this book is so necessary that when we, in the community think about Mike Brown as an adult, how many of you, if I wish I could see you, I'm a teacher, so I love interaction. I'd ask you to raise your hand. How many of you have a teenager? How many of you have had a teenager who reached their 18th birthday? And how many of you would describe them as a man? No. Very few. It's still the adolescent brain. The brain research teaches us that young people and the adolescent brain is still evolving until the early 20s. Okay. The adolescent brain doesn't completely evolve and mature until the 25th birthday. So understanding, and moreover, Mike Brown had only turned 18 3 months prior. So he's every bit of a teenager. And he every bit belongs in this book. And so I just thought so the research tells us, this is the last piece I'll give you on this, is about the ways in which Black children are adultified in our minds, right? And so after Tamir Rice, who was 12 years old, was shot, the officer who killed him kept talking about how he looked so much older than he was. They kept focusing on the fact that he was wearing an extra large jacket, a size 36 pants. He stood 5'7", all these details that they wanted to offer up such that it would obscure the very 12-year-old face that they were, that they should have seen. And so, there's research done, more empirical research done after Tamir Rice was killed by Philip Atiba Goff and some of his colleagues, demonstrating that both civilians and police officers very often perceive Black youth as significantly older than they are. On the average of 4.53 and 4.59 years older than they are, right? So then you're looking at a Mike Brown, okay, and he looks to be 24, 25, right? Or even a Tamir Rice looks to be 17, 18 in people's minds. That has an extraordinary impact on our characterization of them in dehumanizing ways, our willingness to try them as adults in adult court, or to arrest them for normal adolescent behaviors without having any empathy, and for it helps explain why there's force used against young Black kids.
Right. No, and to that point, these are kids, and they have parents who are part of the story. And of course, in the situation involving Mike Brown, we know both Mike's mother, Leslie, Big Mike. They have spoken internationally about their work. To try to change the situation. They've created nonprofit organizations. Disclosure: I'm on the board of the Michael O.D. Brown We Love Our Sons and Daughters Foundation, founded by Leslie. But you write about the impact on the rest of the family, parents and siblings. What else could you say about that? And how should we think about the effect on the rest of the family?
Yeah, so I strongly recommend. It's so funny. All your themes are falling along chapter lines. So chapter 11 is really all about the Black family in the era of mass incarceration. And what does that mean? And I have to say that, as a Black woman, educated, relatively middle-class Black woman, I I know very few Black families who have not been directly impacted by the criminal legal system in some way. And my family is no different. And so as I was writing this book, chapter 11 ended up being the most painful and difficult chapter for me to write because it drew up so many memories for me. My brother, I talk about my brother and his very tragic experiences in the criminal legal system. So I'll leave a little cliffhanger for you, but it was very, very painful. And I began to think about the ways in which policing impacts siblings, right? And, that's as a start. And then thinking about parents. And, research, again, there's very little research about the impact of policing and incarceration on siblings. There's a lot of research on the impact of parental incarceration on kids, but not on siblings. But what is out there confirmed very much my own life experiences, being worried about my brother's safety all the time, sadness of having lost a friend or a companion, anxiety about visiting them in prison. And many young people talk about the shame and embarrassment of having a young person or a sibling, a brother or a sister in the system, right? So, having nightmares and family strife and discord. So that's the siblings. And then thinking about the parents, right? Thinking about Leslie McFadden and Big Mike, his dad, as you call him. And so writing this book was really, really painful because I tell a lot of stories from my own life experience and from my clients' life experience, but the stories of the parents, of other parents, are not my own. And so what I wanted to do was to make sure I watched interviews, that I watched documentaries so I could hear directly from their voices. And so really it was about watching Mike Barron's parents talk about their experience, watching Samaria Rice, Tamir's mother, watching Khalif Browder's mother in interviews, watching Jordan Edwards' parents in interviews about the aftermath of losing a child, right? Losing a child to police brutality. And it's beyond devastating and painful. It's the traumas that we spoke about earlier on the youth really transfer over to the rest of the family. And I'll say this and kick it back to you, but like I personally never have forgotten the first time I saw a child in handcuffs. And I just was devastated. I was like, I don't even understand that this is really happening, right? And that was when I was living in North Carolina, and I just was blown away. Like, wait a minute, why is that little child in a handcuff? And then I also, as a criminal defense attorney, have never forgotten the first time a mother burst out crying when she saw her child being escorted from the back of the courtroom into the court the well of the court in shackles, and she just burst out crying. And so these moments are really profound for families.
Yeah, so profound. So I do want to take a moment to remind the audience that if you do have questions, please drop your questions into the chat box. We are going to take questions. I think we have time for some back and forth. I see Shane Mullen joining us. So is this the Q&A time, or do we have time for one more of my questions?
Sure. Yeah. Let's go ahead and do one more of your questions. And then I have like a question of my own, and we have a question from Craig as well. So,
well, really, really quickly, I have to say that, out of all of this pain, we had protests,
Mm-hmm.
and the protests didn't stop in 2014. Continued for over 300 days out there in Ferguson and St. Louis. That's part of the reason we have so much admiration for protesters in that wonderful city. But in 2020, we saw what happened once again when George Floyd was murdered, and we saw the response. How can protesting help Black youth to heal and build resistance in the face of this persistent injustice?
Yeah, that's such a great question, especially coming from Justin. This is wonderful, because I think of you as the movement lawyer, right? And thinking about, getting us to focus on on engaging people in protest and their rights. And so you're my go-to on that, as you know. So yes, I mean, we all need to feel valued and heard in our communities, and adolescents are no different, right? Our ability to speak out, to challenge, to resist, and to insist upon change is really at the core of the democratic process, right? And so research has been done around this very question, that organized social and political movements really create a sense of belonging for young people, right? Especially marginalized youth who otherwise feel like they've been excluded from society. And so young people who engage in activism really feel better about society. They feel better about themselves. Research shows they tend to be more hopeful about change, the prospect for change. So all of the things that are important in adolescence, like community, building community and solidarity and friendships, teaching leadership skills and strategic thinking. And so, what's so fascinating about all of that research is that we recognize that civic engagement has become so important in American society that many schools now incorporate civic engagement as a part of their curriculum. Yet, what happens when Black youth protest in partnership with Black Lives Matter or the like? They get criminalized. And so I talk about that in the book, that even the protest movement and the ways in which young people and Black youth in particular engage in those movements gets demonized and criminalized. So really, really a great question. Thanks for that, Justin.
Yeah. And I want to encourage those protesters to follow in the footsteps of like Cori Bush and become the people who are making the change. So, yeah, and fantastic conversation. I just think that this conversation is incredibly important and necessary, and I'm very happy that we are able to be a part of it this evening. So let's start with a question from Craig. Has trauma that has impacted Black youth been marginalized to the point where it has become socially accepted trauma? And have our youth been convinced to accept their trauma as normal?
Absolutely, in a lot of ways. So it's interesting, the framing. Has it become socially accepted, and have young people been convinced to accept it? The way I almost want to phrase it is, some of it is you don't know when you don't know. And so, in other words, there's so many people who care about children and who care about Black children in particular, and have no idea the depths of the trauma. They have no idea about the depths of the racial trauma, the depths of the racial discrimination and the impact it has. And so, is it socially accepted? It becomes socially accepted because we don't know and we're not asking the right questions. Right. And so for those of you who are listening and want to know what to do, one of the solutions is getting in conversation with young people in your community, Black and brown people in your city, and asking these questions, having focus groups and figuring out what it's like to live in constant conversation with being in constant presence of the police. So I think that's right. And do I think that young people are now convinced to live with their trauma? Here's what's so interesting. So Justin asked me about chapter 9 and my client, Kevin. In that scenario, it's a perfect answer to this. My client called us on the phone and said, "Hey, I'm afraid to come out because police are sitting outside." We could hear his mother in the background yelling, "Boy, nobody's out there waiting for you. The police aren't waiting for you. You're just being paranoid." And I thought to myself, this child is not being paranoid. He's just traumatized. And his reaction is a trauma response. And so even his mom, right, made him believe, unintentionally, she's a wonderful mom, made him believe that somehow he was in the wrong for feeling and fearing the way he felt. So,
I'm curious, and I don't know if this is a topic brought up in the book, but I read an article not that long ago about public defenders and the kind of how they aren't really advocating for their clients as best as the system is set up, like should be providing. And so I'm wondering if you both as lawyers have any like plan, like if you have, how did I write this? How can public defenders be better advocates for their clients?
Beautiful question, and very much invited by this book. What is the role of advocates? And so here's the thing: we as defenders can become cogs in the wheel. We can become complicit in the structures that drive more kids of color into the system and push them deeper into the system with more severe sentencing outcomes and the like. And so that said, there are organizations, including, mine at the Georgetown Juvenile Justice Clinic. We've launched our Ambassadors for Racial Justice in partnership with the National Juvenile Defender Center. We do a racial justice toolkit, and Justin has helped us with our ambassadors program. We do a number of racial justice training programs. We partner heavily with the National Juvenile Defender Center and our soon-to-be Galt Center. And really the agenda is driving awareness and training and responses to racial injustice in the system. I would then also add Gideon's Promise, down in Atlanta, run by John Rapping, also doing this work to really raise the level of practice. And more importantly, to raise the resources, the funding available for quality, zealous defenders, right? And then, of course, just the work around racial justice that Justin's organization, the Thurgood Marshall Center, is doing. So I certainly kick it to you. I mean, there are different ways we do the work in partnership on the front lines as defenders, but then in partnership with organizations like Justin's.
Right, and one of the things we'd love to do is take this movement lawyering model and try to make sure that we represent not just individuals who are vulnerable, but also work with community organizations and others who are engaged in trying to change not just public policy, but make real fundamental social change through other things that we can do in addition to things that we do in the courtroom. People think about lawyers, they think about the courtroom work, but there's public education, public teaching, public pedagogy, like what Chris is doing. This is part of the same work that she's doing in addition to what she does in the courtroom. And it's just an extension of that: writing, engaging communities, helping communities lift their voice, and being someone who helps a community advocate go from being a parent or a teacher or someone who's directly impacted to someone who can testify at a hearing when there are some sort of police reform proposals that are brought before local government agencies and city councils. So there's so many things that you can do as an attorney to try to amplify people's voices and fight for justice, in addition to what you do in the courtroom. And we try to make sure that the students at Howard University, who often are at Howard or at law school because they want to see this particular problem solved, they were inspired by what they saw from the Ferguson protesters. Many of my students are in law school because of what happened in Ferguson. So that type of work is something that's very, very central to what we do. And, we're really glad to be partnering with people like Chris to make it a reality.
I want to remind everyone watching, first off, thank you so much for being here this evening. Chris, will you hold up this incredible book again? Yes. I want to remind everyone that it is available for sale at Left Bank Books. It is on our shelves now. You can buy a copy for yourself, for a friend. We can mail it anywhere in the country, or if you are local in St. Louis, which if you are, you should definitely be reading this book because it is a very important topic in St. Louis that we should be discussing and working to fix. So I want to thank you both for this just incredible conversation. I'm very happy that Facebook worked tonight and was able to help bring in some people to watch this event. And if you watching felt that this event was as important as I did, feel free to share it on Facebook, on YouTube, and let other people watch this and find out about this incredible book and the incredible work that both of you are doing.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having us and supporting, these conversations. This is really important, and giving me an opportunity to be in conversation with Justin Hansford.
Yeah, this is great. This is great. Thank you.
It's great to have Justin back in St. Louis for even just a little bit virtually. So.
Excellent. Thank you.
Well, have a fantastic rest of your evening, and we hope to see everyone again really soon.
All right.
Take care.
Take care.